All right. Good afternoon, everyone. For those that don't know me, I'm Adam Sills, Head of Specialty Underwriting at CapSpecialty, and I'm really pleased you've joined us for our third installment of, we've now called it 25 Minutes with Cap, COVID cleaning, exposures and risks faced by contractors during the pandemic. You know, our first two webinars tackled the professional and healthcare liability areas and how they might be affected by the coronavirus pandemic. Today, we look at the people who are charged with actually cleaning up coronavirus. So who are the people doing this? And also is interesting, who are the people insuring this and how? Here joining me to discuss this are Tony Anzalone, Head of Specialty Casualty here at CapSpecialty, Brian Pushic, our Environmental Product Line Manager, and also Ross Driscoll, President and CEO of National E&S Insurance Brokers. We have a packed agenda, so I want to get started right away. Welcome, guys. But the first thing I want to do here is, I want to take the three of you back to March when this coronavirus crisis really started to hit. Ross, was the environmental insurance market prepared to deal with the needs of contractors who were tasked to clean?
Yes and no. We were bombarded with calls from our partners asking if their fire and water restoration contractor insurance had coverage for the virus. So I spent several days looking at companies' forms and reviewing their definition of pollutants. And some of the companies had a positive grant of coverage in their forms, and some of them didn't. So the ones that had a positive grant of coverage, I asked them if it was going to be their intent to continue to, have a positive grant of coverage. A couple of the companies immediately said, we're going to create an exclusion tomorrow. So they wanted no part of it. One of the carriers that actually had the word microbial, I looked up the Webster's definition of microbial, and virus was one of the 5 families of microbes. So I called the product line manager of this particular company and said, oh, by the way, you're covering virus. By the way, their form was written. They immediately tried to create a form to limit or sublimit the exposure, not take all the exposure. A couple of the companies who originally said no came around and said yes. And one of the companies that actually said yes actually said no. And 2 of the companies that said no stayed no's. So that's kind of what we faced in March for the first 3 weeks of the pandemic.
Sure. Brian, talk about how you and the team have looked at this issue.
Sure. So I would agree with Ross and say yes and no. I think the carrier side was prepared and was not prepared. But from our perspective, our policy form clearly contains viruses in the definition of pollutants. So that was very clear from the onset. We also had a sizable number of insureds that were already performing work related to biohazard cleanup, crime scene and trauma cleanup, medical waste disposal, to use some examples. Where I think the industry was not prepared was, quite frankly, just the size, scope, and reach of the pandemic and all the industries and contractors that it was really affecting. And then subsequently, the large number of companies that saw it as an opportunity and wanted to get into the COVID-related work. So it became challenging because we had a lot of accounts that we may have underwritten initially as a certain risk class, priced a certain way, offered terms a certain way, that maybe midterm we're looking to change their operation and then thus change their risk profile. And that was something that we hadn't really underwritten for when we initially looked at the account.
So what do you do in a situation like that?
Where they're changing potentially midterm?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think one, you have to look at what their core business is and how those skills translate to what the COVID cleaning work may be. You also have to look to see if they've received training in the past, or they're looking to do more training in the future to be brought up to speed on this type of work, how the accounts performed in general from a loss history, standard underwriting things too, but really either have the experience, training, knowledge, skill set that would translate well to COVID related.
Right.
Adam, if I can interject.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
I'm sorry, Adam, I just wanted to interject that I think that this was a challenge not only for the carriers, but for the producers as well, wholesale and retail producers, because they had a lot of their customers calling, wondering if they could get into it, you know? So it was a challenge for all three in the space.
Right. Once you start, and then Ross, when you start to look at how people have covered or not covered these types of contractors, has there been consistency?
Yes and no, again. It took a lot of educated companies about available training programs that were out there, especially trainings programs with different trade associations. And then the first thing we looked at was a lot of the larger, better restoration contractors were already qualified to do this type of work because they had training, they had technology, they had people, they had experience. And many of them for years had been working in hospital environments, nursing home environments. Some of them even in the past having done anthrax and Ebola. So we looked at that, and some companies were consistent, some weren't.
When you have people who, okay, fine, you know, you're cleaning up Ebola, that's a similar type of, you're talking about a biohazard, but the people who aren't, the people who have said, okay, now there's business to do, how do you make sure that they're prepared to do the cleanup, that they have the right types of protections? How do you make sure they have the right type of insurance?
Is that for me?
Yeah, sure.
All right. Well, here's what we did. You know, with the pandemic was going, you know, we were seeing a lot of contractors that wanted to go into this COVID cleaning work. And, you know, obviously they weren't qualified to do it. They had no experience in it. They didn't know what they didn't know. So what I did was I looked at the top tier restoration companies first and looked at them and what made them better risks. And then how could we translate that into doing a whole new class of business? So what we did is we put together some training programs coupled with the service contracts, the best service contracts out there for restoration guys that these people could use who have never bought environmental insurance before, never had any training, or didn't even know how to spell the word environmental. And the goal was to actually help those who've never been in this type of business and eliminate the barriers to actually get in this business and actually have proper coverage.
Brian and Tony, is this good enough? You're talking about particularly hazardous cleanup here. Are you concerned that the contractors are too inexperienced to be doing this?
Well, you know what, Adam, initially, and I'll take this one first, initially, we were very concerned about that, especially considering that we had virus included in our definition. So as Brian mentioned earlier, we had insureds on the books who we did not plan and who had not planned and did not represent that they did this type of work. They didn't plan to do this type of work, but now they were doing this work. And that was concerning for us. We also had a lot of startup companies or folks coming out of the woodwork, new business submissions coming in April, May, June for companies that wanted to start up. And quite frankly, we were basically saying no to those. I told Ross and a couple of accounts he brought to us, not interested in startups. And that was simply because the training really wasn't there. There was bloodborne pathogen training, as Brian mentioned. There was crime scene trauma, bloodborne pathogen crime scene trauma training in place. And as Ross mentioned, there were companies that focused on that. But for the standard guys who wanted to get into this and gals, it just wasn't there. Brian, some additional comments?
Yeah, I mean, just to reiterate, I think that it was a challenge because, you know, there's certain skill sets that lend itself well to, I think, the COVID cleaning, whether it be the donning of PPE, the use of disinfection or sterilization procedures, disposal of infectious materials, and naturally your biohazard, your hazmat guys, your medical waste disposal contractors have those skill sets. It is, you know, it became a question of whether contractors or insureds operating in other areas have those, has that experience, has that skill set, and maybe they do use PPE in other areas, such as like asbestos abatement, or maybe they're used to using chemicals such as pest control. So there are other industries where they may not be specifically doing biohazard cleanup, for example, but they do have a skill set that translates over to the COVID cleaning. Couple that with formal in-depth training and some contractual language, that could helps us get more comfortable with that risk exposure.
I mean, we always love when a small business goes and does training, and it's always great for an insurance company to suggest, hey, people should be more trained. It's quite another thing for people to actually go and get that training. Ross, how hard has it been to convince, a small business like this to go get what we're viewing as the type of important mandatory training to do this type of cleanup?
Actually, it's been pretty easy.
Really?
Yeah, so most of the people we're seeing are people that have already been in business, some type of business already. They're already successful business people. Most of them are smart enough to know there's things they don't know. So we're telling them straight up front, here's a couple of training programs that are available to you. If you take these training programs, you successfully complete them and you get certified and pass the test, and for you and the people that are working for you, that are working on the jobs, and we vetted the training too. We actually sat through the training and were the guinea pigs for the training ourselves to see if it was real or if it was just cosmetic. But it's real training, and if they did that coupled with the contractual part, then we could write them. If they didn't do it, we just can't write them at all because they're unwilling to actually make themselves a eligible risk.
Sure. Tony, getting to the business side of it, as an underwriter on the business, how has this affected submission flow? This is about as hot of a topic as there is.
Yeah. So Brian and I, quite frankly, for the months in the depths of COVID, were really challenged by this. So was our underwriting team, because we saw a tremendous amount of flow coming in. And it was very, very difficult for the underwriters to ascertain the level of experience. Right away, we put a supplemental application together because we felt, okay, if you're going to be doing some COVID cleanup, there's some additional questions we need to ask, and there's training we want to validate. But the biggest question back then when this was first initiated was, are you planning to do proactive cleaning where you're just walking into facilities to do some proactive cleaning? There's no confirmed cases of COVID in the building, but the building owner wants to just make sure they're doing proactive cleaning. Or are you doing actual decontamination where there are known cases? So the submission flow was coming to us. These questions weren't even asked, so it was making it very burdensome. The supplemental app, though, really helped. And we really needed to differentiate that decontamination versus that proactive cleaning. And once we established that, that helped us. And then we learned right away that, if a contractor was going to go into medical facilities, health facilities, there were temporary health facilities set up in New York where the Javits Center that needed to be turned and cleaned. Those were risks that we stayed away from unless we knew it was a top national company that had done and been trained to do SARS cleanup and crime scene trauma cleanup, bloodborne pathogen cleanup, and they do that all the time. So it was a tremendous amount of legwork up front, but the thing that was most challenging was there were a lot of companies that wanted to get into this and they couldn't find insurance, and we weren't willing to look at them. And that's where Ross came in and said, all right, we've got to come up with a solution and put some training together. And we really liked the programs that Ross put together and worked hard to do. And we have confidence that if someone sits through that training program, they've got the base level to do that proactive cleaning that we were talking about.
So if you have someone, let's say they're a pest control risk and they want to get into the COVID cleaning, are you expecting that these people are now buying a new policy, or are in some of these cases are they able to get the coverage from their current insurer?
All right. So what we're finding out with the pest control guys, Most of the program guys and the carriers that write pest control, if they find out that one of their insureds is actually doing COVID work of any sort, they immediately are issuing a midterm cancellation. They want off. They want nothing to do with it. We're not necessarily looking at the pest control stuff. We're looking really at the COVID risk. That's the part we're interested in. So if there's a couple ways to do it. The insured could set up a separate entity just for the COVID cleaning, and then he has no problems with his carrier that's currently writing the pest control company, and neither do we. Or if they elect to keep that coverage in place, we can do a bolt-on. So we'll do, the GL and the CPL or standalone CPL specifically for the COVID operations and define coverage strictly to COVID operations with nothing to do with their other day-to-day business. So that's how we've handled that problem.
Sure. The, Brian, earlier you talked about contractual recommendations and making sure that contractors have the right types of contracts when they go into these types of engagements. Brian or Ross, could you talk a little bit about what you think these clients need to be doing to protect themselves?
I mean, I can take that first, and Ross, if you want to speak to specifics.
Go ahead, Brian.
Like most of the insurance that we insure and that we look at, it's always a positive when they have strong contractual language that they utilize for their jobs and execute contracts, clear contracts prior to them commencing work. With regards to the COVID work, they should be having. We want to see our insureds having their clients sign off on the scope of services prior to them starting any work, and then also acknowledging that they're purchasing a service and not necessarily a guaranteed elimination of the virus, just because of the nature of the virus. It's near impossible to warrant that you've completely eliminated the virus from a space, and the minute you leave a space or open a door, it could be recontaminated. Ross, if you want to talk about specifics on contractual language.
Yeah, sure. The big thing with the contracts is we don't want a contract where they say that they're disinfecting or cleaning or something like that, because they're using that word as a verb, and that's bad. What we want them to do is to say, we want them to, we have contracts available where they'll say they're purchasing a process, and it's a one-time process. There's no guarantees. 5 minutes after they leave, the place is cross-contaminated. Everybody knows it, but they're getting a process and not a result. Secondly, a couple of things we did in the contract was limit the statute of limitations. So many states, the statute for BI is 2 years. The contract limits it to 1.5 years. Another big thing that we did in the contract is, architects and engineers have been doing this for years with GCs. They'll have a contract which limits the damages to the dollar amount of their contract. So in the contract that we're asking everybody to use, if they do a $10,000 job, the maximum recovery that anybody can get from our contractor is $10,000. So those are just 3 of the key bullets. There's lots more, but that should help eliminate a lot of garbage claims. Yeah,
sure.
And I'll interject.
Yeah, go ahead, Tony.
Adam, I'll just interject that when those contracts were first developed, we weren't certain how the contractors' clients would respond to those contracts, but there has not been much pushback because most clients understand that to get these services, the contractors can't guarantee their work, and the clients aren't expecting that. So that's been a positive for us.
Thanks. Stepping back and looking at the environmental liability business in general, Ross, if you could start here, how have you seen that marketplace evolve since the pandemic?
Well, the carriers have had some time now to assess the situation and become more comfortable with the risk. Initially, everybody, of course, was completely hesitant, and now as time has evolved, some companies have are deciding if they want to be in, and some companies that are in have already decided they want to be out. That's the evolution I've seen.
Tony, any other type of add-on to that?
Well, certainly, yeah.
In terms of the evolution of the business? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, when we initially started working in this area in March and April, we were really one of only a few select companies in our small to middle market space from an environmental perspective that was affirmatively providing the cover. We saw that as an opportunity for us, but at the same time, we were cautiously optimistic that we were going to have everything under control and have the proper controls in place and coverages in place. What we've seen is that there have been quite a few additional markets in this space that have gotten comfortable with the risk over time and have decided to enter the mix. Even some of the larger carriers, I know that there are some large markets that have started actively approaching contractors with CPL policy specifically for this COVID work, starting at a minimum premium of $25,000. But we're at the opposite end. We're really at that smaller end. And I think that as the pandemic has become more and more geographically dispersed, it's made it more challenging for us to determine if a site needs proactive cleaning or is getting proactive cleaning and services versus remedial or decontamination. So the market's also blurred there, where we once had a rate for proactive and a rate for decontamination services. We try to do that as much as possible, but that's becoming a little bit more challenging because it's difficult to know whether a site has been actively, what's the word I'm looking for, has active COVID cases within it, right? So that became more challenging. So we have to be adaptive and flexible with that. And I think other carriers have done the same. So it's really evolved quite a bit. And I think many people are more comfortable at the carrier side in the underwriting ranks to look at this business than before. However, we feel that we've got a pretty solid forum. And with the program that Ross has put together and the training he's put together, we feel we have some differentiators that stand out for CapSpecialty.
That's great. We're now kind of coming up toward the end of our time, but we have a bunch of questions that came in here, so I wanted to start to address some of them. If I don't get to any of the questions, we'll look to respond to you directly after our time here. But the first one is, are there other unexpected changes to the marketplace, if not directly affected by coronavirus, caused by some of the economic shutdown? And I'd look for answers being specific to the environmental space. Brian, do you want to try to tackle that?
Well, I mean, I think it's caused everyone to really dust off their policy forms and look at their policy language and truly identify what the intent of their policy was. You know, we talk a lot about contractors, consultants, and during this call and in our space. You know, there's also a huge exposure for site pollution policies, including business interruption, which is often provided on those site pollution policies. So I think carriers really had to look at that, and that's caused, you know, how those claims really shake out and end up is to be determined. But I think that was a risk or an exposure that really no one saw coming from that angle.
Right. I'll time here. I'm going to do two more quick ones. Understand if you need to drop off. Are there preferred products or cleaning methods specific to COVID cleaning that we'd suggest?
Yeah, I can take that one. I mean, really, contractors should be following the CDC and EPA guidelines for COVID disinfection and surface cleaning, and which includes using EPA preferred disinfectants that are on the EPA list N, which they are approved disinfectants. So they really should be following those guidelines.
Yeah, there are upwards of 500 chemical cleaners, on that N list. Last we looked at it. So the EPA has really approved quite a few for this purpose.
Here's one. This might be a tricky one. What about existing policies for the medical transportation industry that have GLPL? Is there coverage for medical transport for this type of cover or for this type of exposure? We'll come back to you.
Yeah,
Come back to you.
I would say that I can try to answer it if you want. Under the GL, I would say you're probably likely not going to have coverage specific for a virus. Usually viruses or pollution is excluded under the GL. When you say PL, I'll assume they mean pollution liability. I think that when it comes to pollution, it's always tied to the insured's work, and if there's a pollution release, and you have to satisfy those requirements to really typically trigger the coverage. So there may or may not be coverage in that scenario, but it's really hard to tell in a broad hypothetical situation like that.
Okay, great. And one last quick question for the group before we let you go. Regarding COVID cleaning, is there an online resource for applications, coverage descriptions, and sample contracts?
That's a great question. Ross, that's one for you.
There you go. Yeah, if they visit our website, at www.nationalens.com, we have a landing page specifically for this product that we're marketing. There's applications there. There's some basic information there, and then anybody who goes there can feel free to pick up the phone and call myself or somebody inside my agency or Brittany in my agency, and we'd be more than happy to answer any questions. Specific underwriting questions, we'd be more than happy to answer for anybody that reaches out to us.
Great.
Oh, by the way, our email address, is COVID19@nationalens.com.
Great. Wonderful. Good email address. Tony, Ross, Brian, thanks a lot for the time. Everyone, thanks for joining the presentation, and hope you have a good rest of the day. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank
you.
Adam.